and welcome to our direct talk. Today we have an expert joining us, Molla Reda. He is an expert in international relations. I'm Mariamana. I will be the host for the day, and we're going to start out with our question. It's been almost weeks since the Tigrayan forces withdrew from the neighboring Afar regions, and yet there has been very little improvement on the access in terms of humanitarian aid. Within just few dozens of trucks arriving earlier this week, were you surprised?
Not in the least. Thank you for having me first, but not in the least. Unless one has been living in a cave or one is a visitor from an alien civilization, there is nothing surprising about what the Abiy regime and its domestic and foreign allies have been doing to the people of Tigray. They have been persistently aggressive about the obstruction of humanitarian operations, exposing millions of Tigrayans to extreme hardship. At the end of June 2021, the Abiy regime imposed a deadly blockade on Tigray, preventing the entry of critical humanitarian supplies, including medicine, food, non-food items, and fuel, again exposing millions of Tigrayans to extreme hardship. According to the United Nations, about 100 trucks per day are needed to meet the vast scale of humanitarian needs in Tigray. And based on this conservative estimate, between mid-July and the end of March, when the regime actually declared a humanitarian truce, we should have expected about 26,000 plus trucks to arrive in Tigray. In reality, we had 1,339 trucks arriving in Tigray, which represents a mere 5% of the required aid, which doesn't begin to make a dent in Tigray's calamitous humanitarian and medical emergency. And so there is nothing surprising about what these guys have doing. And even in the aftermath of the cessation of hostilities agreement, or the so-called humanitarian truce, during the month of April, about 170 trucks have arrived in Tigray, which represents a mere 5% of what's, again, required to meet the humanitarian need in Tigray. So there has been a pattern of obstruction on the part of the Abiy Ahmed government, its domestic and foreign allies, actively preventing the entry of humanitarian supplies into Tigray. So recent developments are not surprising, although they are shocking in light of the humanitarian catastrophe that they have engineered here in Tigray.
Okay, so in an open letter recently sent by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, sent to Secretary General Antonio Guterres by Debretsion Gebremichael, said the international community was complicit in the suffering of millions of Tigrayans by failing to hold Abiy Ahmed's government accountable after it declared humanitarian truce last March, but failed to live up to its promises, as we all know, and by allowing him to link military and humanitarian issues. But the government of Tigray has since withdrawn from neighboring Afar regional. I mean, despite the government's opposition to the linking of military and humanitarian issues, its withdrawal surely rewards the Abiy Ahmed's government to signals linking military and humanitarian issues is effective strategy. Don't you believe the government should have insisted on status quo ante instead?
Right, it's a great question. It is the official position of the government Tigray, as far as I know, the restoration of the status quo ante. Territorial status quo ante is part of its long-term strategy to resolve the conflict. So among other things, invading forces from Eritrea and Amhara forces must withdraw from Western Tigray, which they have illegally seized. And the Eritrean military still occupies parts of northwestern, central, and eastern Tigray. So the government of Tigray has on multiple occasions insisted on the restoration of the pre-war territorial status quo ante. And so that's an official position, and I don't think it's going to change anytime in the future. The second point is in terms of our withdrawal from Afar. Now, the government of Tigray, again, in principle, is committed to the idea that humanitarian issues must be decoupled from political issues. And humanitarian assistance is provided to those in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, not simply on the basis of their identity or on political considerations, but on the basis of their humanity. The fact that they are in need in the context of armed conflict necessitates the provision of vital humanitarian supplies. Having said that, the international community has failed the people of Tigray by not holding the Abiy Ahmed government and its domestic and foreign allies accountable for engineering a colossal humanitarian crisis here in Tigray. And so the government of Tigray has a responsibility to explore different mechanisms by which critical humanitarian supplies can be provided to the people of Tigray. So our withdrawal from Afar should be understood in the context of the government of Tigray doing everything possible to facilitate the provision of vital humanitarian supplies to the people of Tigray. Now, having said that, the government of Tigray did not have any interest in occupying any area outside of Tigray. But at the same time, because our enemies, unscrupulous as they are, have capitalized on our presence in Afar region to prevent the entry of humanitarian supplies into Tigray. And so our presence in Afar to begin with is necessitated not by the desire to hold and occupy territory, but by the desire to neutralize persistent threats emanating from that region, launched jointly by the Afar Special Forces and an entity that's armed to the teeth, organized, mobilized, and directly led by the Eritrean government. And so our forces undertook limited defensive operations in Afar in order to neutralize that threat. And unfortunately, our limited defensive presence in Afar has been exploited by the Abiy government and by the Afar regional authorities to deny the people of Tigray the necessary humanitarian assistance that they require to survive. And so the government of Tigray decided to withdraw those troops that had a limited presence in Afar in order to deny our enemies further opportunities to keep obstructing humanitarian operation in Tigray, thereby exposing millions of Tigrayans to extreme hardship.
Okay, so asking Tigrayan forces to withdraw from the defensive position so that a civilian population can have access to aid. It's surprising that the world wants to set this type of precedent, isn't it? And the world has almost stopped pressing Abiy Ahmed's government on the restoration of basic services. Isn't this all strange? Abiy Ahmed's government is being thanked and asked politely and repeatedly to do something he is required to do under basic principles of the international humanitarian law. I mean, does this make any sense?
Great question. No, it doesn't make sense at all. It's extremely tragic that the Abiy Ahmed government, in addition to preventing the entry of humanitarian assistance, has suspended all kinds of socioeconomic services, including telecommunications, banking services, electricity, and cross-border commercial activities. And particularly, the suspension of banking services has put millions of Tigrayans under extreme hardship because they cannot access their hard-earned savings from the bank. And that has compounded the already catastrophic humanitarian crisis that has been raging in Tigray. The international community, unfortunately, has, apart from making perfunctory calls for the regime to restore these vital socioeconomic services, has not gone beyond strongly worded statements of concern. And obviously, statements of concern are important, but when these statements of concern are detached from concrete actions to compel a change of course on the part of the Abiy government, the result is deteriorating humanitarian situation here in Tigray. And as a result of this reluctance to hold the Abiy Ahmed government responsible for imposing a deadly blockade and preventing humanitarian assistance from reaching the people of Tigray, thousands of Tigrayans have already perished from hunger and easily preventable disease, and thousands are dying every day, in some cases without even the world watching, because the consequences of the siege, such as telecommunication blackout and transportation-related problems, make it virtually impossible to actually receive and send timely updates. So the extent of the humanitarian crisis in Tigray is a lot greater than what's reported because of the all-encompassing blockade that's been imposed on Tigray.
Okay, so every time a number of trucks arrive into Tigray, no matter how small or how insignificant to address the humanitarian situation on the ground, the UN agencies and the world leaders make a point, either tweet or issue statement on the matter, and these statements are ever so rarely clear about how meager these humanitarian supplies will be in addressing the crises on the ground. How do you feel about this?
This is the usual dance by the international community.
And also, the open letter from President Debretsion discusses the possibility of putting in place the system to facilitate regular and sufficient and unfettered aid to flow into Tigray. What do you think that can look like? Sorry for cutting you off.
No problem. As for the first question, the international community has a full set of facts about the responsibility for the obstruction of humanitarian operations, and that must be laid at the feet of the Abiy Ahmed government, its regional allies, as well as the Eritrean government. And the international community, because they are fully informed about who is responsible for this obstruction, are frustrated. But at the same time, when the Abiy Ahmed government engages in what appears to be a good faith effort to facilitate humanitarian operations by allowing a handful of trucks to cross into Tigray, the international community usually sees that as a sign of progress. And so the reason members of the international community keep tweeting and issuing statements of gratitude to the Abiy government is because the Abiy government has been unusually reluctant to allow humanitarian assistance to flow into Tigray. And so every time it allows a handful of trucks to come to Tigray, that's usually considered a sign of progress by the international community. But it is not. The gap between what's arriving in Tigray and what's needed to address the vast scale of humanitarian needs in Tigray is huge. And the international community needs to exert a robust pressure on the Abiy Ahmed government to facilitate unfettered humanitarian access to the people of Tigray. The second question, when President Debretsion says there has to be a system in place to facilitate unfettered, regular, and timely access, humanitarian access to the region, what he meant is that the provision of humanitarian assistance should not be a function of the emotional whims or the emotional mood of the Abiy Ahmed government. The government in Addis has not just moral, but also legal responsibility under international law to facilitate the provision of vital humanitarian assistance to the people of Tigray. And so the issue of humanitarian assistance provision to Tigray should not be about whether or not 20 trucks arrive in Tigray on a given day or 50 trucks arrive in Tigray on a given day, but the provision has to be sufficient, timely, and regular without any kind of impediment imposed by the Abiy Ahmed government. And I think that's what he meant in that letter.
A few weeks back, the United Nations General Assembly held a session to discuss Russia's membership to the UN's Human Rights Council, while the Ethiopian and Eritrean government voted for Russia to maintain its seat. The world has more or less anonymously voted to remove Russia from the council in light of atrocities its soldiers have committed in Ukraine. And were you surprised that the world did not even discuss the possibility of removing Eritrea from the council? And do you believe it would have been appropriate to do so? And what would be the best argument you could put forward in that regard?
Right. Russia has been virtually unanimously expelled from the UN Human Rights Council for unleashing premeditated, unprovoked attack on an independent sovereign nation that also happens to be a member of the United Nations. And true to form, the Eritrean government actually supported Russia on the UN Human Rights Council. Now, I'm not sure whether I'm surprised or not. I'm not surprised that the international community has not seriously considered efforts to expel Eritrea from the United Nations Human Rights Council or any international institution for that matter. But what I can say is this. Practically every international institution in the world reflects the composition of the world's regimes. So we have democracies, we have non-democracies, and so international institutions are no exception, and the UN Human Rights Council is not exception. But what is problematic is that autocratic nations like Eritrea and other like-minded nations that have little regard for human rights are still represented on the United Nations Human Rights Council. And I think that has almost irrevocably tarnished the image of what supposedly is an august United Nations body that is responsible for the protection of human rights around the world. The Eritrean government, since its joining the international system as an independent nation, has been a destabilizing force in the broader Horn of Africa and beyond. It has sponsored insurgencies. It has financed and armed terrorist outfits. Since November 2020, the Eritrean military has been participating in the genocidal war in Tigray. unleashing all kinds of mayhem and destruction across Tigray. It has weaponized starvation against Tigrayans. It has weaponized sexual violence against Tigrayans. It has destroyed socioeconomic institutions in Tigray. It has engaged in massive extrajudicial killings in Tigray. It provides the military muscle behind the annexation of Western Tigray by supporting the Amhara expansionist forces. It continues to occupy parts of central, eastern, and northwestern Tigray. And in the areas that the Eritrean regime has brought under its occupation, it continues to commit vicious atrocities against the people of Tigray. The Eritrean regime is the antithesis of a democratic nation that respects human rights around the world, and it has no business being represented on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Whether or not that's going to happen, I think we should wait and see, because the international community thus far, despite the presence of a large body of evidence about the responsibility of the Eritrean military for all kinds of atrocities in Tigray, has not taken any kind of meaningful action against the perpetrators of these violent human rights violations across Tigray.
And I would actually like to discuss a recent report published by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International on the atrocities committed in Western Tigray. What was your takeaway?
Well, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are two premier human rights advocacy organizations in the world, and they have done a fairly extensive work here in Tigray. And the most recent report written by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch focuses on Western Tigray. And they have systematically documented vicious atrocities that have been committed against the people of Tigray in Western Tigray. Amhara expansionist forces, as soon as they took control of Western Tigray, would go on to try to rid the West of Tigrayans. They have committed a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, and the objective behind that campaign of ethnic cleansing is to manufacture a new demographic reality on the ground in order to justify their illegal seizure of a constitutionally recognized Tigrayan territory, that's Western Tigray. And they have added an extensive body of factual detail and corroborating evidence in support of the fact that the idea that the invading forces in Western Tigray have engaged in all kinds of crimes that amount to the violation of international law, and for that they have to be held accountable. One of the things that they have done is they have corroborated the fact that ethnic cleansing has taken place. And on the face of it, this finding, though significant, is not a new finding, because the US State Department had almost a year ago identified and publicly made a declaration that ethnic cleansing was taking place in Western Tigray. And that campaign of ethnic cleansing has gotten worse since that declaration in March 2021. The second point I think I would like to make is that the Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have done an impressive work despite some of their shortcomings under what I consider to be extraordinarily difficult circumstances. The Amhara government, the Ethiopian government, and the Eritrean government have been staunchly opposed to the very notion of independent investigation into atrocities committed during the war on Tigray. And if these organizations could uncover a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing and other crimes in Western Tigray under extremely difficult circumstances, you can imagine what unimpeded investigation, a genuinely independent investigation, would uncover in Western Tigray. Therefore, the next step is for the international community to compel the Abiy government, the Eritrean government, and the Amhara regional government to accept the International Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, which has been set up by the UN Human Rights Council to undertake independent investigation into all atrocities that have been committed during the war on Tigray. The Tigrayan government has accepted the Commission's mandate and legitimacy. On the other hand, the Abiy government has publicly threatened to withhold any kind of cooperation, even going so far as to threaten to prevent them from having any kind of access to the crime locations in Tigray and elsewhere in Ethiopia. And so an independent investigation, a genuine independent investigation to be conducted by an impartial, independent international entity is important to shed light on what happened in Tigray and to hold perpetrators accountable by bringing them to the court of justice.
So the idea of a contested area, like for example, Badimma or Abyei in South Sudan, like implies that it's not really clear on which side to demarcate a contested area, right? But Western Tigray is constitutionally demarcated within Tigray. There's not really much of a legal confusion here. But why do you believe the report called for a peacekeeping mission?
There is no legal confusion about the status of Western Tigray. Western Tigray is a constitutionally recognized, historically valid Tigrayan territory, and there is no question about it. But you have to understand that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are human rights organizations. Their most significant currency is their credibility. And their credibility is a function of the perception and reality of their independence, neutrality, and impartiality. Now, we know the Amhara region has been making and has made baseless claims on a legitimate Tigrayan territory. And there is no historical or legal or constitutional basis for that claim. To me, there is no basis for that claim. To you, there is no basis for that claim. But the mere fact that that claim has been made puts these organizations in a sticky situation, because the resolution or the adjudication of these competing claims is not their area of responsibility. As a result, rendering judgment on the veracity of claims on either side would probably put them in a difficult situation. As far as the recommendation of peacekeeping mission is concerned, I would say two things. One, it is not an unusual recommendation in the context of armed conflict. When there is a breakdown in central authority, the state loses its capacity to manage conflicts, the state loses its capacity to provide security, and therefore, because it has lost its ability to serve as a guarantor of peace and security within its domestic jurisdiction, a neutral third party might be well positioned to provide security. This, I think, is the theoretical justification for their argument, but I will come back to it in a little bit, whether this theoretical justification is actually valid. And the second point is, because the Ethiopian state is actually one of the belligerents in Western Tigray, it's implicated in the systematic violation of human rights of Tigrayans in Western Tigray. It has lost all credibility to serve as a neutral guarantor of security for all of its citizens. So the recommendation might have to do with that, I think, because the Amhara regional government cannot protect the rights of civilians in Western Tigray. The Ethiopian military, soaked as it is in criminal activities in Western Tigray, cannot protect the rights of Tigrayans in Western Tigray. The Eritrean military has been implicated in the systematic violation of human rights of Tigrayans. So these three entities cannot be trusted to provide any kind of security for Tigrayans in Western Tigray. So the recommendation of a peacekeeping mission is this. But this is the incorrect position. The international community should actually call for the withdrawal of these invading forces from Western Tigray, the restoration of the territorial status quo ante, and the reestablishment of the legitimate government that actually elected by the people of Tigray in Western Tigray. And that legitimate government must protect its own citizens, that must be given an opportunity to protect its own citizens, and that legitimate government should govern its citizens. Several thousand Tigrayans from Western Tigray have been displaced from their homes, and they should be able to go back once the legitimate government of Tigray takes its rightful seat in Western Tigray. And so the idea of a peacekeeping mission is understandable theoretically from the organizational logic of both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But as far as I'm concerned, the international community should insist on the withdrawal of all invading forces from Western Tigray and the reestablishment of the political and territorial status quo ante in Western Tigray. Only then can we address the pressing humanitarian situation in Western Tigray. Only then can we actually undertake a campaign to hold the perpetrators of massive human rights violations in Western Tigray accountable for their crimes.
Oh, Dr. Molla, thank you so much for
You're
joining
welcome.
us.
Thank you.
So this edition of Direct Talk ends here. Thank you for tuning in.